Bob really understood what made the Post tick, having spent his entire journalism career there. He maintained high standards in the newsroom, and he helped inspire a whole group of us. I remember that when Bob was stepping down from his managing editor's position, he gave an interview in which he cited as one of his accomplishments the fact that there had been no major screw-ups on his watch. Now, at the time, I thought that was a somewhat narrow view, given how many Pulitzers and other things had been achieved. But I must say, now that my wife and I have ourselves assumed responsibility for another great Washington organization and are focused daily on not screwing this place up, that I've come to have a much greater appreciation for what Bob meant and also for how much he succeeded. Since stepping down as managing editor, Bob has continued to report and write. His latest book, Act of Congress, is his 8th one and turns out to be especially timely. At a moment when many people are despairing about the incessant partisan warfare and loss of any will to compromise in Washington, Bob has produced a fascinating and authoritative and very instructive account of how a big, consequential law, the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act, got passed. Because this story is about a very substantial piece of legislation that actually was enacted, you'd think it would be an argument for how Congress can actually work. But in fact, Bob shows quite persuasively that Dodd-Frank was really the exception, that its passage had as much to do with dire circumstances and luck as anything else, and that in fact, Congress is truly and tragically broken. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Bob Kaiser.
Thanks. I like that so much, I'm tempted to ask him to come back and do it again. It's great to be here. 4th time, I think, I've introduced a book at P&P. There's a photo circulating on the internet that depicts what looks like one of those cheap signs that inexpensive motels use to advertise free HBO and breakfast. But this one is more pointed. It says, "Can't we just throw Congress off the fiscal cliff?" Somebody out there deserves a prize for capturing the spirit of the times, I think. In recent polls, the approval rating for Congress falls somewhere between 9 and 15%. I've been wondering, who are those approvers? And what is it that they approve? It's easy to joke about it, too easy. But Congress really is our essential national institution, as I put it in the subtitle of this book. When Congress doesn't work, the country isn't governed. That's a serious problem. A lot of people have given up on Congress. No surprise there. But giving up won't help. Understanding might. That's why I wrote this book. I think a lot of Americans don't have any idea really about how this thing works. Maybe those that find the time to read this will get one. I have a long history with Congress. It began with my first paid job in journalism. I was a copy boy for the AP, Associated Press, in the House Press Gallery in the summer of 1962, 51 years ago. In '63, I went to work for the first time for the Post as a summer intern, and the Post took me off into Capitol Hill. In the '70s, I was the Post correspondent in the Senate, a wonderful education. In the '80s, as Brad said, I became the editor responsible for the staff that covered the Congress. And then I became the managing editor and kept stuck with him. But then I escaped from editing in the aughts and returned to the real work of journalism. I got really interested in money and lobbying. I wrote a lot of stories and then a book, So Damn Much Money, about lobbying and money in Washington. I've always been a kind of an aficionado for the Congress, even when it drives me nuts. In the fall of 2008, I got a phone call from Barney Frank. Now that we're traveling down memory lane, I will point out that Barney and I first met in 1961, when he was 21 and I was 18. We were both student politicians and delegates to the National Student Congress. Mark Furstenberg, who's here today, was there as well. When he made that phone call, Barney had finally become the kind of important person that he had always dreamt of being. He was the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee in the midst of a dramatic financial crisis. He hoped to use that opportunity to make some history. Your next book, he said on the phone, should be about this stuff. What stuff? I said. The financial crisis, the fallout, a huge story. What's the book? I said. Oh, that's your department. But I was looking for a new project, and I thought about what he said. What if he and Chris Dodd, his counterpart in the Senate, chairman of the Banking Committee, whom I had also known for many years, what if they would let me watch them respond, watch them draw up and pass the bill that they had both already promised, a big bill imposing new rules and regulations on the financial system. The question that always interests me the most is, how does it work? It seems to me that's the classic reporter's question. No one had written a good book answering that question about the modern Congress. Could this be my chance to write that book? Yes, indeed. It is difficult to imagine better reporter's luck than I had on this story. First of all, the Democrats had just won big majorities in the House and Senate, enough seats to actually govern for a while, and help a new Democratic president, of course. Thanks to that unlucky combination of events, the 111th Congress that served in 2009, 2010, not so long ago, is actually going to go down as probably the most productive in modern history. When you read tomorrow's paper about Congress, keep that in mind. Thanks to Dodd and Frank, I had an absolutely fabulous perch from which to watch what they did. Both men talked to me regularly over the next year and a half. I actually have transcribed interviews. This is an opportunity, Brad, you can think about it. Transcribed interviews of both of them that are a total 110,000 words. That's enough to fill a 275-page book. Maybe we could sell it. Right. Just as important, they allowed their aides to talk to me on the record as the story unfolded. I have another book full of transcribed interviews with the men and women who did most of the work that made the Dodd-Frank bill happen. This was highly unusual. Congressional staff usually operates invisibly. Of course, staff talk all the time to reporters off the record, not for attribution. Their job is to aggrandize the role of their boss. It isn't usually to get the truth out. So this was a new kind of arrangement. Aggrandizing the boss's role helps keep the secret that Teddy Kennedy let out of the hat in his memoir, which he published just before he died. Kennedy wrote, and I quote him, 95% of the nitty-gritty work of drafting bills and negotiating their final form is now done by the staff. That marks, wrote Kennedy, an enormous shift of responsibility over the past 40 or 50 years. Yes, it does. The roles of senator and congressman have been transformed in the years since I first started to take a notebook up to Capitol Hill, as I hope this book makes clear. Today's members routinely spend a day, 2, even 3 days out of their week pleading with strangers on the telephone for money, trying to raise the money they need to run their constantly increasingly expensive re-election campaigns. They travel home nearly every weekend to cultivate political support, which guarantees, of course, a stunted work week in Washington, usually 3 days, sometimes 4. It also guarantees that members never develop friendly social relationships with members of the other party, even or with members of their own often. And ever since 1994, when Newt Gingrich led his Republicans to control the Congress for the first time in 40 years, each biannual election cycle has been a do-or-die contest for all the marbles, control of Congress. We now live in an era of constant political warfare and perpetual campaigning. This is one of the peculiar characteristics of the modern Congress that I learned, I think, doing this reporting for this book. Characteristics that define the culture of the institution and explain why it is now so exasperating. I came to the conclusion that the Dodd-Frank saga was not just a congressional adventure story, but also a kind of parable, a nonfiction parable of 21st century American life. Politics, not life. Well, life is politics. I don't think it's possible to understand Congress without some appreciation for its culture. And many elements of that culture are not so obvious. For example, fear is the great motivator of Congress. Crises, like the crash of 2008, produce fear, as I think readers of this book will realize. For most members, the greatest fear is that he or she will be blamed for the crisis. Blame avoidance is probably the first reflex on Capitol Hill. So a crisis creates favorable conditions for accomplishing something important. A genuine crisis increases the risks of not doing something, to the point where it actually seems riskier, or can seem riskier, to do nothing than to take the chance of doing something, even if that something proves imperfect. This happens only rarely. Voting no is easy. Voting yes means voting for something likely to change the status quo. Members don't like to do that. Barney Frank explained members' lack of ambition to me in a wonderful quote from this in the book. Quote, "The notion that members of Congress are power hungry is just the opposite. Most members like to duck tough issues, but crises make ducking harder." The second element of the culture. Congress is a reactive institution. In the modern age, it typically reacts to proposals from downtown, from the administration of the day, and rarely involves taking initiatives on its own. I don't think this is what the Founding Fathers expected. Congress, of course, is the subject of Article 1 of the Constitution, because the authors of it expected the Congress to wield most of the government's power. But the great presidents upended this expectation. Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, Truman, Johnson, all set a pattern that has become standard operating procedure. The president proposes, the Congress disposes. So it was in this case. The concept of sweeping regulatory reform actually came up first in the Bush administration. Hank Paulson, Bush's Secretary of the Treasury, published a blueprint for regulatory reform that contained many of the elements that are now in Dodd-Frank. Once in power, pushed by the crash, the Obama administration did propose legislation. Franks and Dodd's committee reacted to and sometimes modified the administration's proposals. But calling the bill Dodd-Frank cannot alter the fact that most of its substance came from the Treasury Department and the White House initially. Third element of the culture of Congress. The preeminence of the executive branch is made much easier by the general decline of the expertise and policy experience of members of Congress. I think my readers may be surprised to see how far that decline has gone. Lee Hamilton, a wonderful member from Indiana for 34 years, retired now a long time ago, 1999, explained this to me. When he came to Congress, as Lee put it, Policy was the preeminent concern, at least of good members like him. Politics was something that came up every 2 years when it was time for re-election. By the 1980s, Hamilton said, politics had displaced policy. Members who shared his policy interests became rarer and rarer. Politics became the principal preoccupation. There are 535 members of the House and Senate. You may be startled reading this book to discover how few had a sophisticated understanding of the policy issues covered by Dodd-Frank. I reckoned and wrote that the number could easily fit on the 25-man roster of a Major League Baseball team. And of course, the number is smaller by 2 today, since both Frank and Dodd have retired from Congress. Their successors as committee chairmen are not remotely their equals. The people who are now attracted to run for the House and Senate are unlikely to be experts in the financial markets. Indeed, they're unlikely to be experts in any public policy issue, or in very few. Fourth element of the culture. Non-expert members do a poor job processing complicated legislation. In this case, a huge piece of legislation with fundamental consequences for the largest sector of our economy, the financial sector, passed through the Senate and the House without their members ever carefully dissecting or debating it. The Senate Banking Committee never held a proper markup or section-by-section review of the bill. House Financial Services did somewhat better, but its review of the legislation was still cursory. Floor debates in both houses consisted mostly of rhetorical flourishes related not to financial regulation, but to political posturing. The House debate was rather a farce. The world's greatest deliberative body, as the Senate likes to call itself, never really deliberated on the provisions of the bill. In the end, most members had only the sketchiest notion of what the bill contained or how it might alter the financial sector. Typically, all but a handful voted the party line. Democrats for Dodd-Frank, Republicans, with 3 exceptions in the Senate and 3 in the House, 2 of whom were gone already, voted no. Members were also surprisingly ineffective, by my lights, in committee hearings, especially when television cameras were present. Both committees held dozens of hearings on the legislation, taking testimony from administration officials, outside experts, Federal Reserve Board officials, bankers, and lawyers. I sat through many of these, and I don't think I ever saw a single instance when a member's question embarrassed a witness or exposed a hidden fact. A fifth characteristic of the culture. Members of Congress are surprisingly unpowerful. Indeed, they're pretty impotent. Individual members of the House rarely have any impact on a piece of legislation unless they are committee chairmen, close colleagues of the chairman, or members of the leadership. Senate rules do allow individual members sometimes to have some influence and make a mark of their own. Nevertheless, as you know, most members cultivate the impression that they're really good at getting things done, bringing home the bacon, and so on. This leads to a lot of bloviating rhetoric at election time, but is far removed from reality. The single talent that would probably be most useful for a member of Congress today is the ability to make compromises. Chris Dodd said this in a wonderful exit interview he gave to one of the TV networks. Yet, as Dodd put it, no one runs today for the Senate advertising how good they are at compromise. But that's exactly what you need, said Dodd, to be able to be successful in Congress. In this age of partisan warfare, few seem interested in compromise, and only a tiny number of members could be called really effective legislators. Sixth element of the culture. Weak members empower staff. As readers will discover, The story of the Dodd-Frank bill suggests that Ted Kennedy may have understated it when he said 95% of the work was done by staff. Staff of the Banking and Financial Services Committee spent thousands of hours, thousands, on this bill, hearing out the pleadings of special interests and lobbyists, consulting with practitioners and experts, drafting legislative language, consulting with the experts downtown, considering the political implications of the various choices before them. Among members, only Dodd and Frank personally devoted the same amount of energy to the legislation. The heroes of my story, I'm pleased to report, are here today. Two women that most of the smart cognoscenti in Washington have never heard of. Jean Russ-Lanowick, who was the staff director of Barney Frank's House Financial Services Committee, and Amy Friend, chief counsel of the Banking Committee. I'm flattered that they came this afternoon. They had more influence on the bill and on the process that produced it than any members other than Dodd and Frank. They presided over the careful, line-by-line vetting of the legislation that members avoided. When, on sadly relatively rare occasions, their bosses made deals about specific provisions, Dodd and Frank assigned Friend and Russ-Lanowick to turn those deals into legislative provisions. They in turn relied on the smart experts who were their colleagues on the committee staffs. It was my judgment by the end that the intellectual candle power of the staffs significantly exceeded that of the members. One more element of the culture. The fact that most members of the House and Senate are indifferent to policy, weak on substance, and ineffective at legislating doesn't seem to matter. As our politics have degenerated into tribal rivalry, the realities of budgets, tax policies, global warming, foreign military adventures, and such rarely make an appearance in the one arena that our politicians still take seriously. That, of course, is electoral politics. When was the last time you were impressed by the intelligence of a member of Congress talking about a policy issue? You may have a good answer to that question. We do have a lot of smart and good members of Congress, but they're not the majority. And it's rare indeed for an election to be resolved on the basis of a serious policy debate. Slogans, emotions, and 30-second TV spots are much more important. So we tend to ignore issues, even pressing ones. What will our grandchildren make 25 or 50 years from now of our record in this last generation on global warming, for example? I'm reminded of the name of an 80s Washington rock band, Shudder to Think. Final element of the congressional culture that I want to mention today. I think Congress has been changed by the lucrative employment opportunities that have become available for both staff and members when they leave Capitol Hill, mostly in the enormous Washington lobbying industry. According to the Center for Responsive Politics and Public Citizen, two watchdog groups that do terrific research, 1,447 former government officials, 1,447, were registered to lobby Congress and the executive branch on behalf of financial regulatory reform, on behalf of financial institutions and trade associations worried about regulatory reform in the 111th Congress. 75 of them were former members of the House or Senate, including a former Speaker of the House and two former majority leaders of the Senate. Another 148 of these lobbyists were former members of the personal staffs of the members of Dodd's and Frank's committees. These people had all passed through the revolving door that has carried thousands of government employees from public service to lobbying since the 1980s, when this first became fashionable. Personally, I confess I don't like this conversion of public service into a source of private wealth. I don't think Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Hamilton would have liked it either. But it's a fact of life now, and it colors the behavior of a lot of people on Capitol Hill. The most fundamental reality of the Congress is the fact that it's an utterly human institution, and it reflects a huge, vibrant, and diverse human society, the United States of America. It's representative of our society in every sense of the word. It represents ignorance and emotion, crass materialism, and moral corruption, as well as the nobler qualities of the electorate. We don't get a House and a Senate that are any better than we are. Thanks very much. I'm glad to have some questions.
You haven't distinguished between Republicans and Democrats. Do you think there's a difference?
Yes.
Good.
Not a loaded question.
Republicans, as you'll see in the book, Republicans are much more consumed, even than Democrats, with the political warfare. And it got in the way of everything there were good Republicans in this story who wanted to do something, and they were blocked by the bad Republicans who didn't want them to do anything for fear it might help Obama. So yes, there are differences.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about gerrymandering, and to the extent that the absence of a real political debate during the elections may have some of its roots in gerrymandering, which has resulted in relatively safe political spaces from which people can get elected.
I think it's a very important point. If I was a reformer now and had the energy to do it, I would make this my first issue, really. There are states now, Iowa is a good one, where they actually redistrict based on mathematics and nothing else, and it works. And it's possible to do, and every state ought to do it. It's a terrible problem. It's compounded by the fact, as political scientists have shown, that, and as this crowd shows in this store in this neighborhood, people tend to congregate more and more in neighborhoods with like-minded neighbors. So even if there was no gerrymandering, we would have homogeneous districts in many cases. It can't be completely eliminated. But the fact is that even in the reddest state, 35 or 40% vote blue, and vice versa. And those people are now completely disenfranchised the way the system is operating. So it's a big problem.
First, let me say I agree with you so much. I think it's worse than you're actually describing.
That was the title of Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann's wonderful book. It's even worse than you think.
Okay, and maybe even worse than that. But if part of our problem is just that we're running on an old system that maybe made sense a long time ago, and maybe the principles still make sense, how are we going to get into a restructured situation where we have democracy, where we have local control, and so forth? How do we change, how do we resist the tendency to stick with vested interests to where we can't get away from what we know is really falling apart? And the interesting thing is, when the history looks back on us, many cultures have fallen apart. They will say that, boy, they really knew they were falling apart. In other words, everybody's describing how we're falling apart. But where do we go from here? Where do we get down to the principles of restructuring ourselves so that we start to be hopeful and really look towards a good future?
I'm flattered by the implication that I have the answers to such questions, but I don't. I am a great believer in American ability to renew and change. The America that I grew up in, not far from this store, 60 years ago, 65, had no place for black people, no role for women in anything but housework, et cetera, et cetera. My gay brother would have been a pariah in that world, and today he's a big personality in New York as a leading gay activist, and so on. I mean, the world, we have changed and improved the country enormously in my lifetime. But you're absolutely right, the system doesn't look so good. I mean, it's a long and complicated conversation about what's the best alternative. I credit the founding fathers with a smart instinct that we want a system that slows things down. But we got more slowing than we may need now, especially when, for example, a Senate minority decides to make the majority of the Senate 60 instead of 50, as the Republicans have now done. But I'm not a radical. I don't want to throw the thing out, but I agree with you, it has to be changed. And one of the tragic facts, I mentioned global warming, but all of us could spend the rest of the afternoon listing dysfunctions in the society that you'd think a creative, effective national government would be doing something about, but isn't. That's what we've got, and it's a big problem.
And the lack of the conversation was my point, that we're not even getting the conversation going well enough to create that.
And part of that, let me quickly cop a plea before somebody asks me to do it more explicitly, is my profession. We're so consumed now. If Congress is consumed with partisan warfare and perpetual campaigning, we're consumed with perpetual gotcha and irony and conflict. That's the stuff we care about. And it's sad to see. It's not good and not healthy.
I'd like to hear some of your reflections as a person who covered the Senate in the 80s. 70s, where people like Ira Shapiro and others write about the last great Senate, meaning a series of Senates.
Right.
And you were the managing editor in the 90s, and even then, even though there was beginning of a lot of partisanship, Clinton had 8 or 10 Republicans at any one time that he could work with. And even in the midst of the Cold War, we got things through like the Test Ban Treaty, in which a greater percentage of Republicans voted for that than Democrats. And so reflect on what the differences are and what you see, without going into the nostalgia of the last great Senate, what you see as some of the differences that we're facing that we haven't been able to deal with.
Thank you. David, for those who don't know, is the husband of the great Carla Cohen, who did so much to establish this institution, who we miss. Brad was a good introducer, but Carla was better. No, just as good. David, I think the biggest change in your lifetime and mine in American politics, I think about this a lot, is the transformation of the Republican Party.
Yes.
When I was a kid reporter in Washington, many of the leading liberals in the Senate were Republicans. Jacob Javits, Clifford Case, on and on. Hugh Scott, even sort of a liberal. I was bemused to see a really awful story on the front page of the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, chastising Obama for not being LBJ and not twisting arms the way he did to get the Civil Rights Bill through the Senate. Well, LBJ didn't get the Civil Rights Bill through the Senate. Everett McKinley Dirksen got the Civil Rights Bill through the Senate. But this kind of historical forgetfulness is all too characteristic. But I don't think there's any honest way to deal with what's happened without starting with this. The Republican Party discovered, with the Reagan's election, I guess, that there were votes to be made by appealing to baser emotions than Clifford Case and Jacob Javits ever would have liked to appeal to. And the Tea Party phenomenon is obviously intriguing. I know personally, particularly in New York City, wealthy Americans who consider themselves Republicans, who gave money to support the Tea Party phenomenon, and when I pointed out to them that they were likely to rue this, that it was likely to have a bad ultimate effect, oh well, maybe, but it's all right. We can beat Obama this way. That kind of short-sighted attitude has had a huge impact. And I think, if you step back a little bit from the dramas of the moment, just the demography of the country and the wonderful statistic about the youth. The youth are 2-to-1 Democratic now. It's going to take a long time for the Republicans to overcome that. And they're never going to overcome the rise of Hispanic America. They are on a losing wicket. They may not lose this year or next year, but they're on a losing wicket. And that's inevitable. That doesn't mean our future is bright. Our future isn't bright, not least because the Democratic Party is just as corrupted by money and politics as the Republican. But that's another issue for another day. But that's where I would start. And the basic element of this is that the old-fashioned Everett Dirksen Republican, whatever else he believed in the efficacy of government. Government was a tool for sensible people to make a better society. And as you know, there are a great many Republican members today who literally don't believe in government, who literally say in public that they hope the government will fail at healthcare reform, for example, so that we'll get over the habit of turning to the government for help in such matters. This is a profound change. We
functionally amended the Constitution without an amendment with the 60-vote requirement. So even a Hubert Humphrey could not have seduced Everett McKinley Dirksen in this atmosphere.
Great. Thanks.
Wait.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes. Well, which countries are doing it right?
Let's think. Is there an answer to this question? It's intriguing to me the degree to which all the European democracies have developed our problems in politics in much milder versions. But it's not, nobody is immune from this. And Germany is certainly a very well-governed country. Finland, where I spent the summer 8 years ago, and wrote a series for the Post about Finland, is a wonderfully organized and governed country. But it's a country where they're all Lutherans, and they all look alike, and they all share the same values. Makes it pretty easy. Our big contest always, from the beginning, is how to get our arms around this wonderful polyglot culture that we've created and make it work and efficient and so on. So I don't have a list of enviable success stories for you.
There are a lot of people feel, and some commentators have written, that when the banks were really up against the wall in 2008, where they were in desperate need of the government assistance that could have collapsed, that was an opportunity to really rein them in, that they would have had to accept almost any kind of regulation, and the opportunity was missed. How do you feel about that?
Well, it might literally be true, but this is a topic in the book. Both Barney Frank and Chris Dodd and Tim Geithner, all of them, decided right from the beginning that this was too scary to play with, that they were determined to get through this crash, and that they all, I think, agreed that the best way to do that is to support the system we've got, and not, in these parlous times, try to give us a new system. This is an absolutely arguable position. I make it clear here it wasn't by any means automatic, and there's a very good case to be made that they made a mistake. But they were all in the same place, and there was never any evident support in the Senate or the House for a really radical restructuring. There was one very interesting amendment in the Senate, sponsored by Brown and Kaufman, thank you, which would have busted up the big banks and restructured the system. It got 33 votes, I think, or 34. And it's not, that I think was an accurate reflection of Senate opinion. So it is a missed opportunity. Whether or not it would have been a better thing to do, I feel in no position to judge. But it was missed.
I don't want this to end on quite this negative note.
Good.
Though I spent 5 years as a counsel to a senator, and I see things. He was out in 2001, so I haven't been through any of this. I see things the same way you do about a whole bunch of things. However, I really believe people get the government that they deserve, and I think things go in cycles. And we're in a terrible cycle now. But if it's true, the young people have a different point of view and they get interested and do it, we're a nation based on a constitution, and we do certain things in a way, and I feel we're going to work our way out of it. I don't think I see much hope at the moment, but I see a lot of hope in our system, and I hate to see somebody who's had so much fun covering this, I only did it for 5 years, be so negative, because I think things will turn around. That's our system.
I think you and I absolutely agree. I don't have anything that you said that I could disagree with. But my role here wasn't to offer optimism about a mythical future that neither you nor I can actually explain how it's going to come. And I think it's much more useful contribution if I can point out persuasively how bad it's gotten. The last line of my talk was, we don't get a Senate or a House better than we are. I think that's your point. And we at the moment are in a particularly nasty, cynical, ornery state as a country. Chris Dodd, if he were here, would agree with you passionately. And he lived through several cycles in his 6 terms in the Senate. He said, yes, this is bad, but not so many years ago it was really good, and it will be really good again in the future. And that's a perfectly defensible hope. The analytical framework that supports it isn't exactly blatantly obvious to me, but I think it's definitely possible. And I'm just had my 70th birthday. I'm having to think those thoughts of people my age, and I'm not a great pessimist. I've got 2 daughters about whose lives I'm reasonably optimistic, unless we've so screwed up the atmosphere that they're going to have just an awful, awful time. But that's another subject.